hunt begins in earnest, with Lord Henry pitting his wit against a particularly elusive antelope, a terrifying foe indeed. Good day to you, sir, and welcome to my review of The Big Hunt by J.T. Edson, the 13th book of neither The Floating Outfit, Calamity Jane, or any other series that I can work out, but still potentially unlucky for some. The Big Hunt was published in 1967. It introduced the character of Kerry Bannon, a hunter and frontiersman of some repute, and brought back some, by then, familiar old faces such as Mark Counter and Calamity Jane. A former railroad worker and sniper for the South in the American Civil War, Kerry got tired of the wastage and hunting buffalo for the railwayman's lunch. An aborted attempt at creating a ranch of his own has left him hunting buffalo for their skins in the employ of a selfish businessman called Corbin. The excess of wastage in that line of business causes him to down tools mid-hunt and leave Corbin's employment, much to the annoyance of the team of skinners he was helping earn a very good paycheck, and to the annoyance of Corbin himself, who has no desire to see his profits dwindle. Corbin pays his skinners to leave a few lumps and bruises on Kerry's skin by way of persuading him to rethink his decision. Kerry was about to join the employment of the travelling English lord Henry Farnes Grable, a hunting sportsman keen to bring back some trophies from the wild part of the Wild West. Farnes Grable has already employed a freighter or two, the brilliantly named Dobie Killam and his sidekick Calamity Jane, when Corbin's thugs decide to spark their brawl. Soon much of the town is involved in the dust-up, and the law, in Corbin's pay, are forced to stay their bias by Lord Henry's pool with the American president, no less. While Corbin simmers on his revenge, the initially reluctant Kerry throws in with the Lord's hunting party, and the two share both an expertise and a bond over their love of hunting and firearms. The hunting party goes out, bags a wild bison, and is accosted by the remnants of Corbin's thugs. The party returns to town, where Kerry is met by the law and the accusation that he owes Corbin for an unpaid debt. Kerry is about to have it out with Corbin, Old West style, when Lord Henry intervenes, and the prospect of outfitting the big hunt makes Corbin see dollar signs, if not cents. The hunt begins in earnest, with Lord Henry pitting his wit against a particularly elusive antelope, a terrifying foe indeed. He then hunts a cougar. Meanwhile, the rest of his outfit have made camp and attract some unwelcome and impolite guests. These thugs are part of a local gang, and though they are soon run off by the hunters, the next day's hunting ends with the arrival of a messenger from the US cavalry and the news that Lord Henry's sister and Calamity Jane have been kidnapped. Lord Henry musters what forces he can, and he and Kerry prepare a rescue bid. In terms of a story, The Big Hunt is extremely episodic. There isn't a natural flow, and everything just rather lurches from one part to another. For example, Mark Counter turns up with some very safe for the 60s rumpy-pumpy with Calamity, and then takes his leave from the tale without making any impression on anything other than her bed springs. In truth, because there's very little to leave an impression on, the initial hunt taking the group out of town, only for them to unexpectedly catch a big enough buffalo they need to immediately return to town, where they are met with Corbin's last and most feeble effort to get one over on Kerry. The hunt was only ever going to be a brief interlude before the rest of Lord Henry's men arrived that day anyway. But Corbin, although built up to be the closest thing we have to an antagonist, makes this final play with little to gain, but with a third of the book still remaining. The resolution of his part of the story, with Corbin effectively gaining, perhaps even winning, Lord Henry's considerable business, can only be seen as a reward for his underhand scheming. It is in no way a satisfying conclusion to their conflict, and it leaves the book seemingly without a bad guy for its final act. The introduction of some meaningful conclusion that late into the plot is always going to be difficult, and for a brief spell I almost thought that Edson intended to make an antelope his big bad. Lord Henry certainly has more trouble killing it than he does the grizzly bear or cougar that come later. The arrival of Varley and his kidnappers isn't exactly out of the blue. He is revealed to have an old grudge with Kerry, but that grudge was last mentioned when Edson recounted some of Kerry's backstory on page 10, and here we are on page 125, 25 from the end, and there's been no mention of man or grudge in between. The novel's clear highlight, a 12-page brawl in the saloon, takes place to bring the characters together, at the end of the first act sufficiently early that there is never then the suggestion that those heights can be scaled again. The saving grace in terms of plot, the only thing that holds the disparate acts together really, is the growing romance between the stoic Kerry and the English lord's sister Beryl. Beryl treads the fine line between insufferable and ridiculous, but it isn't a trapeze act so much as one muddy foot in each puddle, at least making a balance of sorts. However, as the story lurches along their relationship, smooths out the bumps with a well-handled, gradual and awkward build-up of affection. The otherwise unemotional Kerry is a solid lead, reticent and tall, but otherwise cut from the same dusty fog mould, and his bromance with Lord Henry helps to keep things likeable enormously. In a slight 153 pages, the big hunt plods along without the finesse of the other Edson Western I reviewed, but it's only the resolution of the Corbin antagonism that reminds the reader that nothing much has happened, and it doesn't look like it's going to. But it must be hard to fit a story to the traditional three-act structure when you have three protagonists and they're all already infallible. Lord Henry never puts an immaculately shoed foot wrong. Kerry doesn't learn anything much or change much even in the process of winning Beryl's heart. Even Calamity Jane's intervention and threats have little impact in the resolution of his dispute with Corbin. In truth, it's a little bit of a cheat that he'd seemed to want to resolve his problems with Corbin using violence after avoiding doing so earlier. The idea that he's a bit of a hothead and needs the intervention of others is out of the blue, but it is the closest we have come to character development. Previously a loner, Kerry now has friends and a support network. Shame then that it's Lord Henry's bank balance that actually resolves the problem. But he isn't the only one demonstrating personality traits popping up randomly. Calamity Jane is usually described in a way that is rapidly relevant and then never again. Perhaps being fair, we can attribute some of that to the novel's brevity. A habit of getting into hair-yanking fights with jealous saloon girls is related some 14 pages before it becomes hair-yankingly relevant when she brawls with the jealous saloon girl Big Win. Surprisingly, this counts to be one of the least egregious examples of this. Her overconfidence is related the page previous to her attempt to break a rebellious horse, which lands her in trouble. She's described as practical. The page before her practicality keeps Kerry from exacerbating his problems with the Otley Creek's crooked lawman. As writers go, Edson has a style, and it serves him well enough. This novel includes the same sort of footnotes as his other books that I've reviewed, and the same amount of verisimilitude as other faux westerns. His love of a good brawl is well exercised, spreading like a virus until it seems like Mark Counter is the only one in America not throwing punches. The prose is functional rather than inspired, and page 88, a scene where two hunters creep up on Kerry and Beryl with ill intent and then they are saved by the wolfhound Sean's timely invention, is a good example. The dog's arrival is heralded by this onomatopoeia-heavy description that seems to owe a bit of a debt to Wilfred Owen. At that moment, both heard the rapid patter of feet and rustle of bushes, followed by a deep rumbling snarl. Flame tore from the rifle's barrel, but its bullet tore harmlessly through the trees. But after the hunter's rifle, swung in haste, snags on a tree, we get this unfortunate repetition, easily rectified. We can use roared here or ripped there, perhaps both. But the word harmlessly is not one you want to be using if you're playing up the danger of a situation, even if it is limited to just one of the parties. Change that out for aimlessly or even recklessly. A numbing, burning sensation drove into his arm as Sean closed his powerful jaws on it. Pain beat through him, knifing out from his arm. These last two examples have no significant issue beyond their being repeated in a very similar way when Sean makes his presence known to a different set of bad guys later on. Sean hit the man, teeth clamping him on the arm. Pain knifed through Weiss. His arm went numb and he dropped his gun. But compare Sean's entrance, described as the stuff of nightmares on the same page by one of the thugs on its business end, with this passage from Peter Benchley's Jaws. The fish smelled her now, and the vibration, erratic and sharp, signalled distress. The fish began to circle close to the surface. Its dorsal fin broke the water, and its tail, thrashing back and forth, cut the glassy surface with a hiss. Benchley's prose seems like something from a different age, a far more sophisticated piece with a more careful structuring, its short sentences generating tension. Verbs like broke, thrash, cut all carry connotations of violence. Adjectives like sharp and glassy seem to promise danger as well. Part of this is that Edson embraces the phrases and style of Edgar Rice Burroughs and the Old West, the latter for a minor dose of realism, but in real terms, Edson's effort is from 1967, Benchley's from 1974, hardly eras apart. When Lord Henry's valet locks horns with a cowboy, the violence is supposed to be down and dirty, an old-fashioned barroom brawl. Wheatley slipped the Gandhi dancer's punch, coming up inside it to drive his head forward. A solid click of bone on bone sounded, but Wheatley's butt sent the top of his skull cracking against the other man's nose. The big guy charged, and Reacher turned slightly sideways and bent his knee a little and timed it just right and drove all his weight up and forward off his back foot and through his shoulder into the big guy's face. Kinetic energy is a wonderful thing. Reacher had hardly moved at all, and the big guy bounced off crazily, stunned, staggering backwards on stiff legs, desperately trying to stay upright, one foot tracing a lazy half-circle in the air, then the other. The second passage is from Lee Child's One Shot, putting aside how he generates the sense of impact in the third paragraph with his string of plosives and hissing of those sibilant S's always paired with T's and P's. This passage has a built-in whoosh. You feel that impact in a way that you don't with Wheatley's headbutt. But the real comparison is with the first paragraph here, where the big guy's presence is created by the positioning of his bulk at the beginning and end. But Child's intention is to show how easy this is for the mountainous Jack Reacher, so everything that he does is slight, a little, simple and easy. When you click bone on bone, it makes things seem small, insignificant in just that same way, and is completely at odds with your intention as a writer to make this seem mighty. You know that Child would have said that bone on bone boomed, maybe even boomed right through and out the other side again. You don't need the adjective solid, which doesn't help much if you use a better word to begin with. Edson puts in more effort when Kelly and Lord Henry are watching two buffalo square off for mating rights with their herd. Down the slope thundered the young bull, giving vent to the whistling hiss Kerry knew so well, sounding like steam rushing through the safety valve of an overheated engine's boiler. The charge whistle of the attacking bull shattered the air, mingling with the deep grunt of the older animal which advanced to meet the attack. Both bulls carried signs of previous engagements, open wounds giving mute testimony to a mating battle that had carried on intermittently for the past 18 hours. Although that description of the whistle is a bit overdone and almost becomes a tongue twister, the violence of the two animals comes across as far more powerful, perhaps as you'd expect. But then the issue becomes, why is Edson working so hard to build up what is not much more than an irrelevance than he did his novel's big set piece and his labour of love, a good old-fashioned barroom dust-up? The answer will become fairly obvious shortly, but in part it is down to the real lack of stakes in the story. A minor squabble between two people in a minor town that is solved by a bit of old-fashioned capitalism. They don't even have to involve the Pinkertons. One thing that I really do enjoy about these novels is Edson's wry humour. A cutting remark here, a hint at the cynicism that is the underlay to the Wild West's reputation. This is a dog-eat-dog world in the end, a place where two paths may only cross the once, and courtesy is far from guaranteed by the firearms, as Heinlein prophesied. It adds to the warm camaraderie between Kerry and the English lord, but it allows Edson to describe a rare honest man as a trader who wanted to come back. Perhaps a novel concept in this time. Lord Henry recounts the tale of a man who shot a lion, convinced himself it was dead, and didn't bother to reload his weapon. He was buried with the annoyed look still on his face. It is that sort of dark humour that really lends an extra level to the enjoyment of these books. And the dashes of humour in The Big Hunt are especially welcome. They change the mood from the usual awkward and reserved Kerry. As a protagonist, he would be far harder work without Lord Henry and his entourage, all of whom have something about them, making the fleeting appearance of Mark Counter really unnecessary, and the final act arrival of a handful of extra team members kind of pointless as well. But Kerry walks into town, kills a man's dog, picks a fight with the town's marshal and antagonises the volatile Corbin, and then wonders why he has so many enemies. It takes the bubbly Calamity to draw him, against his wishes, out of his shell, and it's a great character moment for them both, perfectly handled and so natural in a book that's this slim and might have every reason to rush through such development, and if I'm honest, it does on occasion, as I mentioned earlier. But Calamity Jane should be the absolute star of this book. Swinging punches, lead and a whip, as well as making the odd pithy comment. It's a shame she's so often upstaged by Lord Henry's sister Beryl. Of course, Beryl has to do something to be worthy of the reticent Kerry's notice, but does she have to be so perfect all the time? It does rather reach the eye-rolling stage at times. She's too good at everything, hunting along with her brother, breaking horses where others have failed, and her ladylike decorum is only ever threatened by her ability to throw punches with the best, or perhaps worst of them. But then Edson's politics probably wouldn't allow him to write otherwise. He is Prosian in more than just style. The British nobility is noble and gentlemanly, and still able to teach the upstart Americans a thing or two. Lord Henry introducing a handful of cowboys to the finer points of the Queensberry rules. One hopes they remember the lesson when they wake up. Lady Beryl might borrow Calamity's clothes, but only one of them is ever going to end up getting up to no good in the stables. The nobles are above such things outside of marriage. Blood and breeding matters, you see, as does a big fat pile of cash, of course, and Calamity insists that she'll stay too poor to ever marry when she hears of a coming wedding. Beryl already has her sights set on civilising her man, and Lord Henry insists on footing the bill for all of it. With the bromance between Lord Henry and Kerry in full effect, it is the valet Wheatley who has to use his fists to refute any suspicion of homosexuality. A sense of noble fair play is ingrained in the superior upper class. Lord Henry even gives an antelope a sporting chance, or at least a semblance of one, as only one player in that game has a case full of rifles. Still, Edson works hard to make the stakes in the hunt seem like a serious matter, in lieu of having a real antagonist, of course, and he repeats the same trick of "this is our last chance to bag him" when hunting cougars a few pages later. And like Burroughs, Edson can tell a decent story, enjoyable if you notice his political stances or not, but sometimes that wry humour turns effectively on those of the opposing views. Sometimes he even reads more prophetic than his greatest influence, describing trade unionists, those who want equality for everyone, as meaning people who are bringing everyone down to the same level, or trying to. Kerry's attitude of rewarding a wage with a day's work runs him afoul of the unionists, collecting him even more enemies in the process, the kind of enemies who stoke up racism to improve their own position, though Kerry's own language and his insistence there was no racism in the checkerboard gangs seems contradictory. Regardless, the result of everybody pushing for equality is that there is racial segregation where there wasn't any before. But Varley's socialist utopia is doomed from the start anyway, as he observes that the people attracted to it all showed willingness to share other people's property, but they tended to cling to their own. Thankfully, none of this sounds relevant in 2021, or it'd be almost like we've been doing the same political dances for rather too many years. In conclusion, The Big Hunt is the second best Western of Edson's that I've read. The fact that I've only read 2 might make that sound rather worse than it should. It seems Edson can throw a handful of hurdles into his own path and then, well, probably not skip over them, but at least batter them aside. This text manages to inject a dour protagonist into a highly episodic story, devoid of a convincing antagonist, or even much you might describe as stakes, until it's out of nowhere finale anyway, and from this sow's ear still make a very passable purse. His eye for a decent character and a decent character moment remain intact 13 books into whatever this 13 means. Kerry, a stoic at the bare minimum, is brought out of his shell by the strength of some male bonding and the ever-lively Calamity Jane, helped along the way by the novel's least fun character, the perfect in every way Beryl, and their inevitable romance is handled about as well as it can be in a novel this short and a product of both its era and the era it depicts. Edson makes as much from this scenario as he can, but in this one, the scenario is the part that's lacking. The Big Hunt is worth reading, especially if, like me, you live near a bookshop that'll let you trade in your cast-offs for something that's actually worth having. and it is worth having, but I doubt it will be too many people's favourite westerns, because whether you love the open range battles with troublesome Indians or a grim-faced lawman dispensing justice, there is an awful lot of competition, some of which you can find on this very channel, and there'll always be more like it coming soon. So click like, subscribe, and ring that bell, and you won't miss out on any of it. See you in the next one. Bye.